and rely on an interpreter.
It's very important to me also to say then what liberal means to me. And that is in principle what is in the Sapere Aude of the school, which is putting individual dignity and freedom as the basis and as the goal of social, political, and economic thinking. And that is very important to me because there is two sides to this. There is the ethical argument, and that is a little bit also the teaching of the 20th century, that collective identity thinking very quickly crushes the minorities, and as the smallest minority, the individual. So there is an ethical argument, this from George Orwell or other authors who have described this, why it is important to focus on the individual. And the second is, of course, the utilitarian argument that societies that are putting individual dignity and freedom first and as a goal tend to be more creative, people tend to think more people participate in the thinking. That contributes to the society, and in economic terms, that is the idea of a market economy, that everybody does his part in thinking, and that is what also brings economic success. In that sense, my interpretation for the economic collapse of the Soviet Union is clearly that it was trying to organize everything, the whole Gosplan institutes, the economic life, from a central institution, and that is just not working as good as when people think for themselves. And on the moral side, the Soviet Union collapsed relatively early when the original idea of freeing the working class ended up in the Gulag and crushed the moral sentiment for providing a freer future for the working class. In that, then also what Misha Fishman today said about the 80s and 90s, I find it very important to look how the decisions of today change the life not today but tomorrow. And that's very important, that we don't make for everything that happens today the people responsible who are in charge today, but also the people of yesterday. And that's why history is also important, and this discourse about the 80s and 90s. And I would say that very roughly, the chaos and the complete collapse of institutions of the 90s are a result of the 80s and 70s. And the economic success of the 2000s was built on the institutions that were built in the 90s. So there is always a parallel of past, present, and future, because the decisions of today are important for the future, are changing the future and not today. Now about the positive. 3 short theses, and I'm happy for the discussion. The first is, Russians are more liberal than they think. Second thesis, the Russian intelligentsia, and I think the journalists in this room are a good example, and now I'm interested for the discussion. So the second thesis is, this Russian intelligentsia is more liberal than the intelligentsia in most Western countries. And the third thesis, that currently there is a social trend for more liberal solidarity in Russia than ever before. 3 positive theses. The first one, Russians are more liberal than they think. I quote from 2 polls. One we did in 2000, we published the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, for who I work since 2012 in Russia, published a poll about values, and when asked Russians whether their life depends on themselves or on the state or on other people, you can imagine that nearly 70% said first, the life of any person depends on themselves. Of course, this is not only a positive number, because it can also be a criticism of the state functions, it can be a criticism of other people, but that's the first. The second, when we asked what freedom is, it was quite clear that the majority of the population, because it was a representative poll, had a quite clear idea about freedoms. And the highest ranking kind of answer to what freedom means, an open question, where more than 30% phrased typical freedom of choice, of thought, of speech, typical freedoms, and less so what is currently more popular in the West, also for kind of things provided by the state as considered as their freedom. So there is an understanding of freedom, but at the same time there is this big mistrust about which we already heard. And that is, I just liked, it's relatively funny when we ask the question whether Russians live more by the law or rather by informal rules and personal agreements. So two answers. 56% said that Russians live rather more by informal agreements and informal rules, and only 34% thought that Russians live more by the law. But now, the difference, when you ask them personally, you yourself, do you rather live by the law or by personal agreements and informal rules? Then suddenly 77% of Russian population say, yeah, I personally live by the law. And that shows a little bit about the mistrust of others, but also the longing for law. Now, what's interesting about the value survey is a recent survey of the Levada Center of October 2019, where they tried to see what are important values for society in comparison to 2 years ago, to 2017. And that's very interesting because there is real change, which is not so typical in such a short time frame. And very telling, I found freedom of speech as an important value saw only 34% in 2017. In 2019, where it seems to be more a hot topic, it's suddenly nearly 60%. So a dramatic rise in the understanding that freedom of speech is important. When we look at private property protection as a value, 46% in 2017, 57% in 2019. When we talk about a fair trial, after all this reporting about political arrests and so on, in 2017, 50%, in 2019, 64%. So there seems to be a focus and a rise of individual rights questions, so liberal values, you could say. And interestingly, at the same time, questions about values for free medical assistance, free education, went down at the same time. I would think it has to do with political developments, that people were more focused on the thing they seemed important. So this, for my first thesis, why I think Russians are more liberal than they think. The second is the that Russian intelligentsia is more liberal than in the West. I already shared the story that a good friend of mine, who used to be a leftish activist in Germany and active in the German Social Democratic Party, became later the chief lobbyist of European business. And he is since 16 years the head of the Association of European Business in Russia. And I asked him recently when we were drinking beer whether his job working with business has turned him neoliberal. And he laughed for a long time. And then he said, actually, it is not my work in business community that made me understand why you liberals value individual freedom so high, but it's for me living in Russia. And this is what I mean when talking about the difference. In the West, the majority of journalists, of academia, of human rights activists self-define themselves first as left before they would define themselves as liberal. And I have this experience with many, with all the correspondents of German newspapers, that they are so surprised in Russia that the focus of the people they deal with here is more on classical individual dignity and freedom than the collectivist social questions most journalists care about in the West. It's interesting to discuss also with Arkady, who is someone who's traveling between the worlds. And that is, of course, I mean, part of the explanation is the skepticism towards state. It's the skepticism that a collective entity would provide better than we would be able to provide for ourselves if we are protected by the law and more free. Third thesis is about that this new solidarity is bigger than ever before in Russian population. The first one is something we already saw since 2012 after Bolotnaya, when there suddenly started in 2013 this volunteer movement, where suddenly people from opposition and people from Maladaya Guardia and non-political people ended up together being volunteers. And since then, this trend has even risen. There is more volunteers in hospitals, in old people's homes, and in other social projects than ever before. Memorial, even as an institution that is under big pressure, just confirmed 2 days ago to us that they had never as many volunteers for their projects as this year and as in the newest years. The donation for social charities in Russia were never so high as now. And when you look at, when we spoke about Yuri Dud, but we have also other examples about, for example, HIV stereotype awareness, that a video last year would attract nearly 1 million people to watch is something that never happened before. Secondly, in this social trend, there is a bigger urge of people to discuss values, I think, than ever before. We all speak about the 90s of the time of value discussions, but it's of course not entirely true, because it was also the chaos and the personal struggle that prevented many people from discussing values. And I just see this, and that's interesting, as you represent so many different regions. I have seen this at bar camps from Syktyvkar to universities, or Petrozavodsk to universities in Moscow, Petersburg. It is seen in the rise and the huge popularity of these libertarian YouTubers who suddenly, in a generation way younger than everyone in the room, are so popular talking about values. It is, but also seen in the everyday events I see in Moscow. You can go every day to an event talking about ethics, about values, and that in that mass never existed before. The third one of this new solidarity is, of course, the civic activism and participation. It is seen there was never so many independent municipal deputies in Moscow and Petersburg as today, but also in all regions, there was never a time where so many urbanistic initiatives were active. Criticism says often that people become urbanistic activists, civic activists about some square in their town because real political activity is forbidden. But I see this first as intrinsically positive, that more people spend time to try to organize the community in a matter with others. Of course, this activism is also visible in some of the demonstrations. It's seen when people demonstrated against the building of the church in Yekaterinburg. It is seen in the demonstrations in the north about the trash from Moscow. So there is, in specific subjects, more activism than ever seen before in Russia. And of course, it's visible to me when I travel Russia in this rise of Western contemporary cosmopolitan hipster culture. It is in a hipster cafe when I sit in, I don't know, Blagoveshchensk, the same visible as when I go to the wonderful night of the museum in Krasnoyarsk, when every museum person in Germany would dream of this 1,000 of young people who spend their time rather in a contemporary art museum than drinking. And of course, this is seen in contemporary art across Russia. I see this, but it is of course in this global culture that I see transforming inner cities, not only of the biggest towns, but also of smaller cities across Russia. So I leave it with that, 3 theses. Russians are more liberal than they think. Russian intelligentsia is more liberal than the intelligentsia in the West. And there is more liberal solidarity in Russia than ever before. And now Nikolay can question whatever I said, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Julius. Kirill Rogov calls it social ointment. And I believe like church ointment. And I suppose it's a good start for the discussion because the things I will discuss is much tougher and something along the lines that Ina was referring to. We are not here to pay compliments to one another and say how things are good, how things will work out, but just to look realistically at what goes on. This is why I enjoy so much, and sometimes I even want to be invited to the meetings at the school, because it's an opportunity to talk to the excellent team, to Lena Jura, to listen to colleagues whom I otherwise would never find the time to listen to, and also to talk to you as people who travel here with what we call very fresh minds and unbiased minds, very sincere and open. May I allow myself to be like a crowd, very provocative? One of the advantages, as I see it, is that you're invited to talk, not about what you may, go places talking about too, but about it gives you always a good impulse to think about something that you would not have time in your everyday life to consider. That is why please take it as a provocation in part, as an invitation to for the dialogue. I hope the session is long enough, and I hope to see the arguments in favor, and maybe somebody will convince me that I'm not right, I may be wrong in many ways. There's Eli Panyach, a wonderful sociologist in St. Petersburg. One of the key arguments she puts forward nowadays is that our state is getting more archaic, whereas the society is getting more modern. This is why she sees the splitting trends, which sooner or later, and she thinks sooner, would bring to some acute conflict, and as we may hope, it will be something to be the starting point for the modernization of a state. I'm very fond of Ella, but I disagree with Ella that seems to be denying this old truth that every nation deserves its rulers. And this truth is, it's like this banality is not that big because it doesn't refer to the Bible. No, it's very much has to do with political science. We cannot have things like where the development of one part of society should go one way, whereas the society of the state, which is immediately intimately tied to the society, should be moving somewhere in the opposite direction. So two my key arguments will be something like a provocation. First, our societies, as I see it, has been degrading, and it would be naive, as I see it, to hope that without institutions, without elections, without local self-government, without competitive politics, society would in some way or other, it's some kind of vitalism, where society would spontaneously out of nowhere would start to grow muscles. And another point I wish to make is that the young people are not so much as a threat as they are something for the regime to rely upon, to support it. And this is what I want to say about this. In the last 10-15 years, that is the time where the regime has been very rapidly moving towards one direction, towards becoming even more and more authoritarian, tougher. We've had some, tricks that one somehow wanted to hope for as to how things might turn out that would not be so bad as it looks in real life. One of the oldest is that the West would help us. Well, the West has been helping and is still helping. What Julius was saying in general terms is that this is a fantastic contribution by the German foundations that they have been making and still are making to support civil society in Russia, and we are very grateful to them for it. But society, first of all, cannot do things that need to be done by us. They can be just lend a helping hand. But today, other than German foundations, all other Western foundations left Russia for the reasons we know. For 20 years, we've been helping you to build something, and we see where you are, say, things are not doing so well. There are many problems in places that need help, that need aid. Why should we invest in Russia where we see no positive outcomes? Why shouldn't we invest into Africa, where we still have some hopes for better? Another hope was laid on middle class. We've got many good economists who know how to count money, and we had this generally accepted viewpoint that boiled down to this, that at a certain level of development, with a certain GDP, once the country reaches it, the country cannot but turn to be more democratic. In other words, middle class rises, it behaves very independent, it's less dependent on the state. It is like the machine that initiates and pursues change towards greater democratization. This, Russia has never seen it happen for a number of reasons, probably, but it only has to do something that's typical of Russia alone. No. We can see that oil-rich countries of the Middle East, the situation in some ways is very similar. So GDP per capita may be very high, but if this GDP is not the product that your excellent hands, it's something when you pump out from the subsoils, well, it's not at all given that it will somehow radically change the situation in society. That may very well happily continue to exist in the rent redistribution economy. So our middle class are people with a certain level of self-perception as middle class. They're government officials who work for state corporations, siloviki, that is law enforcement and security, and they are much rather the bulwark of the regime rather than somebody who would be moving the country towards degradation. So much can be said about the creative class, that especially of the protests of the 2011-2012, which in point of fact in many ways just services this economy, and in this way it's more interested in keeping things as they are rather than in adopting a change, some changes. The last hope that still is lingering is protests and the growth of social capital. We know that in Russia, social capital is very low, and only the results that were shared with us, with Julius, just testify to this. I am law-abiding, but all others behave just following what is known in Russia as понятия, that is, standards implicitly adopted in sub-criminal cultures. So if we have protests, if we have some organized protests, this gives rise to social connections and ties. This gives a certain level of trust and confidence. This is something we witnessed last summer because of the wave of protests in Moscow. Well, a different story is that it never seems to me that protests and this sort of trend, which probably is there and is probably not defining it all, I don't suppose this may lead to some radical change in the regime, although some changes will certainly be there, although the ties are not that immediate. If something that should happen, if protests are an indicator in the system wants to respond to it in some ways and through modernization in some ways. I'd like to dwell upon two relatively new, if you will, things that help us, that still keep us optimistic, that have to do with my specialty. I was a demographic research scientist and so much for demography, and I will discuss it at length here. So, as in what has to do with demography, well, people already heard it. Natalia Zubarevich has already said that several years ago she came up with an idea of 4 Russias. This idea turned out to be very attractive for the mass media, for the experts of all sorts. The point of this idea is that, may I repeat it, although many of those present here might be aware of this, for you to remember, she's a geographer, economic geographer by her background. She doesn't at all research any protests, political stories, but her idea is that in Russia, economy has many, following the Marxist formula, it exists in several hypostases. There are capitals, Moscow, St. Pete, where the character of economy may predetermine social relations and requirements, and this, in many ways, is the highest modernized part of the country. Roughly speaking, there are Moscow, St. Petersburg, and cities with a population over 1 million. But there are no territorial ties. The elements of post-industrial economy are present in many places, and you may be aware of this in every city where you traveled from. Secondly, second Russia is Russia of the basic Russia, these big cities where industrial production, where Putin appealed to Uralmash plant as to those who would be producing the new elites that were rising, sort of. So we'll get the workers, they will put things into order. That served to illustrate that there is a powerful, but something that seems obsolete nowadays, but nevertheless ongoing work, something that still works, an industrial machine that in many ways works by getting government procurement offices now that much was invented into military-industrial complex. A third Russia is the rural areas, who are almost non-dependent on their state. People are just barely surviving. Many people never noticed that we had a different president or tandem. They paid them the attention, and thank goodness, and sometimes they didn't pay. They may have just planted potatoes and subsisting on their vegetable garden, and this is a quagmire in political sense of the word. They are absolutely see no point whatsoever in how to position oneself and how one should behave. They would much rather, for them, if we speak about vote rigging, what matters for them is that, well, unless we don't look when people just rewrite turnouts, that, as it happens the case in the Caucasus, then I don't know. The secretary of the rural Soviet and of the rural cooperative said we should vote this or that way, otherwise you will never be paid pensions, or they will not give us seeds for plants, and people behave quite rationally. Who cares what happens in Moscow? Who cares about State Duma, communists or non-communists? They don't care two pins. What they care about how their local government works, what about their local relations. So in this country, rural areas every time believe either very conservatively, we may put it this way, or they support at all times those who are in government, but with a certain lag. First, in the first years after Yeltsin, they voted pro-communist, not because they're keen on communists, but because all those former first secretary of regional were communists, they are social support. And Russia number 4, they are national republics, where Russians are not a majority. Karelia, Khakassia, or Jewish autonomy region, where only Russians for that matter reside. It's a way to, it's like nothing new about this. But in national republics, especially in the North Caucasus, and some republics of the Volga region, this is very important because they have a very different model. It's not that people are not that advanced, but very much like in rural areas, they have people vote exactly as they are instructed, because this is quite rational, and sometimes nobody asks them how they voted. They just rewrite, like in Chechnya and Dagestan, they just written down what is the required percentage and report it to the center. This is the basic idea which seemingly used to work. But then Crimea came, and as Zubarevich put it, this model stopped working. Why? Because the level of support of the government of Putin after 2014 has become absolutely the same, both in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as laterally national republics. They will write down as figures that are wanted. But in all other regions and in rural areas, as well as in the cities, it has more or less leveled off. But today Zubarevich is saying that we are again seeing there's some movement, and it's become noticeable, some differentiation between the three Russias. All got just intoxicated. But now gradually the people are coming back to their senses. So this is a very rough model, of course, but it's very popular. I'm saying we have 4 Russias. Actually, when we were working with electoral biography, in some votes, we built what we call voters' profile, where we laid down how the people voted at presidential elections. In every district, say, or in every region, small towns and big cities, and we tried to build it from Arkhangelsk to Sochi, that is European Russia from north to south. Very representative slice of European Russia. So what we saw there is that cities behaved in a very similar pattern. We're often saying that Moscow and St. Petersburg are, back in 1989, they, for one simple reason, because there is no rural behavior, population there. Voronezh, that they would vote very much in 1999 pro-democratically, as they now call it, very much like Moscow, like St. Petersburg. Why am I saying it? It is very interesting that small districts and differentiation lay between the city and the rural areas. In this sense, to add to that remarkable scheme that was Misha Fishman was referring to, how the policy in Yeltsin's time worked, one could add to this a very important matter. Yeltsin had to do with those who were in opposition to him, and with the governors that were very much against him. And as part of his political base, Yeltsin would use the mayors of big cities, that is, municipalities, and especially mayors of the capitals, where the support of Moscow against their own governors. So that's why Nemtsov was in charge of the Council of Municipalities, and they wanted to turn it into third chamber of the Federal Assembly. Nowadays it's gone, and the thing is, it's not that Yeltsin was much keener and was fond of the mayors and Putin doesn't like him. No, reasons are purely political. This is what the policies are about. When everyone speaks in the same voice and everyone votes unanimously for the new draft constitution, it means there's no policy in the country. It's all dead. And quite the opposite, when there is a conflict between Khasbulatov and the Supreme Council led by Khasbulatov, it's not the conflict between the good and the bad. It's a conflict that is normal and that is required in political life. If only institutional framework is there to somehow deter it, for deterrence and to resolve it. We don't see today. If you create this profile today, you will see that differentiation in the region is non-existent. Whatever just the people in government say, this is the way it will work. In this way, mosaic is not made up of small chips and chunks, what it was like at the very first days of independent Russia, for one very simple reason. At that time, heads of regions never had this total control over the region in sense of elections, unlike what the situation is like today. But this is an important thing is here that we're not just a country that is clearly diverse, madly diverse. This already was voiced by Kirill. In Soviet times, we have this, we are so diverse as if you have like Afghanistan and Finland. And Russia in many ways, Karelia is not quite Finland. Estonia, I suppose, would be closer, is better than Finland. But at least this is almost as Estonia, and there is something very much like, say, Afghanistan. One could argue which regions could be put on this list. And the illusion by the Kremlin is that, and the new amendments into the constitution say, you can shut your eyes on this and announce that the regions and regional diversity is gone. Send effective managers are here and there and everywhere, work leading the ministries, then the regions, and in this way to ensure control only over this diverse country. One of the hopes, only simple methods to govern and manage such huge country as Russia without federalism, it cannot be governed. It inevitably would lead to losing both efficacy as well as ability to manage and govern the situation. I suppose this, for the most part, rather than the protests, although protests may be due to these things that I say, may have some seeds of hope. As to demography, there are two parts of it. There is natural movement, there is mechanical movement. There are migrations and there are birth rate and mortality rate. Both are important in terms of prospects of political development of this country, and I mention it in a couple of words. And here, like I'm devil's advocate, I shall say a few words about young people, about demography. There are several points I wish to raise, and I would very much want you to come up with your trying to refute them. So the first argument, the first point I wish to say that anti-regime attitudes in the young people moods are grossly overestimated. If you look at sociology, you would see that, well, yes, indeed, we do see some not very significant, but some matters, yes, but it would be naive to believe that young people, we can see that they're, other than those present here, are the ones who really were born and grew up under this regime. Although the regime got somewhat worse with time, but people who grew up and for whom this is the only possible environment they have ever existed in, and maybe they're quite comfortable in it. It's difficult to suppose that they would all of a sudden, once they come to sort of become adults, they will all of a sudden would want to break this system apart. No. My second point is that young age as a shortcoming passes very soon, and it will be gone before you know it. As the English say, that if when you're 20, when you're not a radical, you have no heart, but if you're not a conservative at 40, it means you're out of your mind. So it's natural that young people at young age want to care, and they care for social justice, just come up against injustice. It's very interesting because we used to think that social base of communists is just rural areas. But suddenly these rural areas first became the social base for Yeltsin and then for Putin, whereas communists only in big cities and in universities gain very high support. So this formula seems to be refuted here. So the point is that yesterday, young people who protested in 2011 became young people and now became parents. Now they started their family, and their radicalism and their desire to protest is gone in many ways. My third point I wish to make is that our society is an aging society. Like all European countries, Russia is getting older. It's not that it's getting older. We are in an aging situation. That means that we see less and less young people, fewer and fewer young people, and middle-aged people and old people get a bigger share of society. And today, President Putin says that he addressed the demographic program. He says that the echo, on the one hand, of the war, the triple echo of the war, on the other hand, the demographic echo of the wild 1990s. And so natural movement, it's rather losing, say, numbers rather than gaining. So anyways, we see fewer young people than more young people. So their ability in some ways to seriously influence the political dynamics is surely decreasing. The fourth point I wish to make is that the young people are just a product of what their parents put them in and education. Very recently we had a very different, where there were many different textbooks. Nowadays it's gone. Their system is virtually well unified, and in this sense, it would be strange to think that such a mature regime as ours will be producing its own, as Marx would tell it, people who would dig their grave. So what's the point of all this? So they produce active people, but only active somewhere. Are they very much like... Well, volunteers are a very powerful Kremlin project. If you want to help your country, please become a volunteer. And it's not a civil society. It is just somebody who helped the state. It's not civil society. There's a certain matrix that seems to be producing people, and today it's aligned very much, and naturally it is producing people who are needed to the system, and they're not the ones who are opposing the system. And finally, if somebody, say, some defects, people speak up against the system, okay, pack your bags and leave. We're not a closed country unlike the Soviet Union. Feel free to emigrate. So people emigrate, and the regime are happy. Those who disagree, the descendants who don't think they're comfortable at home, okay, they pack and leave. The recent public opinion surveys by Levada Center spoke about it at length. 53% among the young people are the ones who are considering emigration. What they can consider, it's all right. It doesn't mean they will immigrate, but 10% out of them are taking some steps in this direction. But any immigration model, it's like push and pull interaction. Something is pushing them out of the country, but this is not enough. It's not enough to consider that a political system in UK seems better to them. It's important that they should allow you to move here. So you don't expect that huge crowds of people would be running off to UK or whatever. But it's not a given that in this country, among the human capital, we haven't lost the critical mass of people, and they are the most active, the people with greatest initiative, creative people who have immigrated from the country, who left the country, and we know that immigration in recent years has been rising. We don't know to which extent. Why? Because the statistics don't allow us to fully appreciate it. Nobody, if you have a Russian passport, will stop you from keeping the Russian passport and never be considered as a migrant. There is a good presentation delivered by Gontmacher about migration and the possible effect it might work on the country's further development, where this emigration might produce. Whereas Lev Dmitrievich Gudkov would call this phenomenon individual adaptation. That is, if you dislike it, so if you are dislike the regime, it would be rational to leave for a regime which you are happy with, which suits you. You don't really attempt to change it all across the country. And the last point I wish to make about the young people is, okay, all right, young people are so pro-revolution. Some of you may be younger than you, and okay, they have finally will make things collapse. Okay, so what? Do you mean there's debris we found ourselves in? What makes you think that it will be better? And today's jail, if you think of it. And if this is the case, and as a society, not only the young people, do we have the experience and the institutions that would help us believe that once we have really what makes us think that things would get for the better? It's difficult to dispute it. No institutions are in place. This material is non-existent. That will help us build a much better regime. And a couple of words for the positive, because we can't end on a bad note. So I believe in some way positive matters have to do with Lena's question for Kirill. It is that we should prepare for not so much and prepare people not so much for revolutions to make this destroy, rather want them to build and to work for active construction after this regime has found itself unable to extend its existence. This, as I say, it is very important. This is a positive thing about this. The thing is that we must develop new experience, we must develop social capital. One has to be all tuned for things to restore and build from scratch the institutions that, regrettably, we do not have today, and get accustomed to working under these institutions. Hence, my second conclusion is that we need to both promote it and to...
This second conclusion is related to, as I said, the urge to construct. Today, for instance, there is a great lack of self-government in Russia, and nothing would change if they put this clause into the constitution. But that's pretty bad. If there is no local self-government, how would a society breed young politicians? Where would what would be the source of responsibility for one's actions? What would be the source for the understanding of democracy? Quite apart from where are we going to have the young managers and, as I said, parliamentaries? The right thing is to understand democracy as an ability and capacity not just to participate in elections, but also participate in the matters of government at all levels, including the need to contain those officials whom we elect. This is the kind of an understanding that that the Russian people must have been developing from the times of Novgorod. But what people invest into the notion of democracy, democratic elections are viewed as a necessity. The evolution of Yeltsin that we spoke earlier today in Mikhail Fishman's presentation is a sad evolution, but this is indeed the evolution, almost inevitable evolution of any leader who is not in check. And this is what we're seeing on the example of Boris Yeltsin. And Vladimir Putin also went through the same evolution. It's just that he just took a much longer period in power. So we're seeing the results. So at this point, I would like to stop my provocation. Thank you.